On today's CSS Breakdown, book by book, from Season 06, Episode 08 of Norman Lowe's Mastering Modern British History, 4th edition, we ask, how did a period of political instability and shifting party loyalties culminate in a landmark reform that dramatically reshaped British democracy? Our mission today is really to give you a shortcut to understanding this, well, truly crucial period in British democratic history. We're tracing the winding path from the profound fallout of the Corn Laws, those controversial tariffs on imported grain.
Designed to protect domestic agriculture, but yeah, kept food prices high.
Exactly. All the way to the monumental Second Reform Act of 1867, and you'll discover it's packed with surprising twists and some very strategic political maneuvers.
And Norman Lowe's Mastering Modern British History is, I think, the perfect guide for this deep dive. It gives such a detailed, chronological, and thematic account of the era. What's really striking, though, is how clearly it shows that this period wasn't just shaped by the politicians in Westminster,
Right.
but by these massive societal shifts and, honestly, intense public pressure from outside.
That's a powerful point about societal shifts. How exactly did those external pressures manifest? And, how did the politicians in Westminster perceive or react to them? Did they see it as a legitimate force? Or maybe something to be resisted?
Good questions.
Okay, let's unpack this. So we're starting right after the repeal of the Corn Laws, mid-1800s. And what's immediately striking is that even though Britain was generally enjoying an era of, well, economic prosperity,
Yes, relatively speaking.
the political scene was incredibly confused, unstable even. What was the core of that instability?
It really boils down to the Conservative Party essentially fracturing over that repeal. You see, you had the Peelites, about 112 conservatives, including big names like W. Gladstone and Lord Aberdeen. They sided with Peel on the repeal. Now, they weren't really an organized party, and their numbers fluctuated a bit, but they pretty consistently voted with the Whigs.
Okay.
On the other side were the protectionists, those who wanted to maintain the Corn Laws. Lord Derby was their official leader, but Benjamin Disraeli was really their voice, their leader in the House of Commons.
And the relationship between them.
Oh, the animosity between these two factions was intense, really intense. And it effectively set the stage for, well, years of political disarray.
How did that intense animosity between the Peelites and protectionists manifest itself in, day-to-day governance? Did it just grind everything to a halt sometimes?
It absolutely created constant government instability. You had Lord John Russell, the Whig leader, continually finding himself needing Peelite support because the Whigs lacked an overall majority.
Right, they were the swing votes.
Exactly. Even as the Peelite numbers dwindled, I mean, they went from 89 seats in 1847 down to just 29 by 1857, they still held the balance of power. It's a prime example of how a relatively small group could effectively dictate terms. We even saw a Whig-Peelite coalition government with Lord Aberdeen as prime minister from 1852 to 55.
A coalition, right.
Eventually, most of the Peelites sort of merged with the Whig Party, effectively forming what became known as the Liberals.
Ah, so that's the origin.
Yes, but the sheer succession of governments from 1846 to 1874, Whig, conservative, Whig, Peelite, liberal, conservative, liberal, it really drives home just how fluid and unpredictable things were.
So we're seeing this intense political fragmentation, but at the same time, the very definition of a major political force, the Liberal Party, is evolving. What did that actually mean for their core beliefs? What did they stand for?
It's a fascinating evolution, really. The Oxford English Dictionary itself defines liberal as, free, in favor of reform, and open to new ideas. So the aristocratic Whig Party started attracting significant support from the wealthy middle class, and that transformed it into a genuinely reformist party.
Okay.
This new liberal identity was deeply influenced by economic and political theorists. People like Adam Smith, championing individual freedom, division of labor, and the wealth of nations. David Ricardo, a strong advocate for free trade.
Big names.
And the utilitarians, like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, who pushed for government to achieve the greatest happiness of the greatest number. So, classical liberalism then coalesced around ideas like individual enterprise, minimal government interference, that's the laissez-faire idea, primarily to remove obstacles and make institutions more efficient, and crucially, a commitment to low government spending.
Right.
Their rallying cry basically became liberty, retrenchment, and reform.
So we have this ideal of liberty, retrenchment, and reform rooted in laissez-faire, but then there's that utilitarian goal of greatest happiness. It seems to me those two ideas could lead to some, well, pretty significant internal contradictions. Were they able to reconcile them?
You've hit on a core tension, a real tension that frankly, still exists in modern governance. How do you balance that ideal of individual liberty with the practical necessity of state intervention for the greater good?
It's not easy.
It wasn't just a 19th century problem. It's a timeless political tightrope. For the liberals, if their goal was the greatest happiness of the greatest number, then surely government action seemed needed in crucial areas like factory reform, religious affairs, education, poverty, public health.
Right, you can't just leave everything alone.
Exactly. This created huge dilemmas. For example, during the Irish famine in 1846, Prime Minister Russell initially declared the government cannot feed the people, and that interference would undermine private enterprise.
Oh.
Thankfully, he later changed his mind, and state funds were used. But what's also remarkable is that radicals like Cobden and Bright actually voted against Fielding's factory bill in 1847.
Against it. But that was the one proposing a 10-hour working day for women and children, wasn't it?
It was. But why did they vote against it? Because it violated their laissez-faire principles?
That's incredible.
Ironically, that bill only passed with conservative support. So these inherent contradictions, they really limited what the liberal governments actually achieved domestically after 1850.
And within this context, we see William Gladstone rising to prominence. He becomes Chancellor of the Exchequer. Given these contradictions you mentioned, how did his personal economic philosophy shape policy during this turbulent time?
Well, Gladstone, who was chancellor for much of 1852 to 1866, was actually a Tory who had converted to free trade under Peel. And he held incredibly strong views on economic policy. He believed that systematically freeing manufacturers from tariffs would lead to cheaper goods, making British exports more competitive, which in turn would increase employment and lower food prices for the working class.
So a kind of virtuous cycle.
That was the idea. He famously stated that all excess in public expenditure is not only a pecuniary waste, but above all, a great moral evil.
Strong words.
His vision was all about fostering self-reliance and prosperity through minimal government spending, rather than relying on extensive welfare schemes.
So he clearly had a strong vision. How did he actually put those beliefs into practice then? What were some of the key reforms he implemented as chancellor?
Oh, he was incredibly active, systematically dismantling hundreds of tariffs across various sectors. His 1853 budget, for instance, abolished or halved duties on over 250 articles.
Wow, 250.
Then the 1860 budget abolished duties on 375 more. He kept going, reducing duties on things like sugar and tea in the mid-1860s. This drastically lowered costs for consumers and really significantly boosted trade. Income tax was a tricky one for him. He'd hoped to abolish it by 1859, but the Crimean War forced him to raise it instead, though he did reduce it again later, realizing it was probably too valuable to get rid of completely.
Understandable.
A really brilliant move, blending political and economic motives, was the Cobden Treaty of 1860 with France. Both nations reduced duties on each other's key goods. Britain cut duties on French wines and brandy. France cut duties on British manufactured goods.
Smart.
And Gladstone also innovated financial legislation. Starting in 1861, he began combining all financial bills into one single large budget bill.
Why do that?
It was a very clever tactic to bypass the House of Lords. See, the Lords couldn't reject the entire budget just to save one unpopular duty they didn't like, which is what they'd done with the abolition of the paper duty in 1860.
Sneaky.
Effective. And let's not forget, the Post Office Savings Bank opened in 1861. It was a huge success, encouraging ordinary people to save and, conveniently for the government, providing a new source of funds.
And what were the broader effects of these Gladstonian policies? How do they impact the economy, the working class? Did they achieve that virtuous cycle he hoped for?
The effects were pretty undeniable. Free trade provided a massive stimulus to the British economy. That Cobden Treaty alone led to a threefold increase in trade with France by 1880.
Freeze cold.
And overall, British exports quadrupled between 1850 and 1870. Coal exports quintupled. Now, okay, other factors like improved communications certainly played a role.
Sure, it's never just one thing.
Of course. But Gladstone undeniably created the right atmosphere, you could say, for the Victorian economic boom. For the working class, this generally meant they were better fed due to rising wages and lower food prices. The downside, though, of Gladstone's relentless economy drive was that it often limited much-needed social reforms. Still, despite that, Gladstone's reputation was significantly enhanced among both politicians and the public, and that directly contributed to him becoming leader of the Liberals in 1868 and ultimately to their general election victory that year.
Okay, so we've seen how internal liberal tensions and Gladstone's economic drive were shaping things inside Parliament. But while Westminster was consumed by these shifts, you mentioned this powerful new force was building outside its walls. After the 1832 Reform Act, many people, including Lord John Russell himself, seemed to believe the question of parliamentary reform was settled. Done. Finished. What factors then, in the early 1860s, brought this issue roaring back to the forefront with such force? Why now?
Yeah, it seemed settled for a while, but several key influences converged, making reform feel imperative again. First, just sheer population changes. Britain's population swelled from 24 million in 1831 to 29 million by 1861. Yet by 1865, out of over 5 million adult males in England and Wales, only about 1 million actually had the vote. The vast majority of working-class men were still completely excluded.
Huge gap.
Massive. And people had moved en masse to the new industrial areas, but the constituency boundaries hadn't kept pace at all. So you had this huge disconnect between where people lived and who represented them. Then there was the relentless pressure from the radicals, notably John Bright. He was absolutely convinced that democracy, the kind they were seeing develop in places like the USA, Canada, Australia, should be adopted in Britain.
He was quite vocal, wasn't he?
Very. His powerful speeches in 1858-59 really revitalized the whole reform debate. He argued that ordinary people needed control over their own fortunes. He famously declared, "The nation in every country dwells in the cottage." Powerful stuff. The trade union movement also played a really crucial role. In the 1850s, you saw the rise of more moderate model unions. Leaders like Robert Applegarth and George Howell consciously demonstrated responsibility. They wanted reform, but through legal means, not revolution.
So working within the system.
Exactly. And they successfully impressed both liberals and conservatives with their seriousness. This led to reform conferences and the formation of the Reform Union in 1864, a significant alliance bringing together middle and working class reformers. And finally, externally, the American Civil War from 1861 to 65 was a powerful stimulus. The radicals saw it as a clear fight for freedom against tyranny.
How did that impact things back in Britain?
While the cotton blockade, imposed by the North, absolutely devastated Lancashire's industrial towns, caused severe unemployment, real hardship. Yet, as the cotton workers increasingly understood the North stood for the abolition of slavery, they swung their support firmly behind the Union.
Even though the blockade was hurting them directly.
Precisely. This maturity, this principled stance, despite their own economic distress, it deeply impressed many politicians back in Britain. It was seen as a sign of working-class political maturity.
It's fascinating how all these pressures, demographics, radicals, unions, even global events contributed to Gladstone's own pivot on reform. How significant was his public change of mind, especially given that clash you mentioned with Prime Minister Palmerston?
Gladstone's conversion was absolutely pivotal. He publicly declared in the Commons in 1864 that, and I quote, "Every man who is not incapacitated is morally entitled to come within the pale of the Constitution."
Quite a statement.
It put him in direct conflict with Prime Minister Palmerston, who was staunchly opposed to reform. Palmerston famously retorted, "I entirely deny that every sane man has a moral right to a vote."
A clear disagreement at the top.
Absolutely. Gladstone doubled down, calling it a shame and a scandal that those politically mature Lancashire cotton workers were excluded from the franchise. Then, Palmerston's death in 1865 was a real game changer. It removed the main obstacle to reform within the Liberal Party leadership. We also can't forget Giuseppe Garibaldi's visit to London in April 1864. This hugely popular Italian unifier, a symbol of liberty, his presence gave added publicity to liberal reform ideas. It directly led to the formation of the Reform League in February 1865, which got significant trade union support.
So multiple forces pushing things along.
Definitely. And even the conservatives, specifically Disraeli, started to pragmatically accept that reform was probably inevitable. His reasoning seems clear. If it was going to happen anyway, the Tories should jump in and try to take the credit.
Makes sense politically.
They even attempted a mild reform bill back in 1859, but the Liberals rejected it mainly because it didn't go far enough in extending the vote to borough workers.
So with all this mounting pressure, what happened when they actually tried to legislate? Given how much the landscape had shifted, you'd think maybe it would be easier, but was it? Or did they hit immediate roadblocks? What's the story of this tumultuous path to actually getting reform done?
Oh, they hit immediate roadblocks, big ones. The first major attempt was the Liberal Reform Bill in March 1866, introduced by Russell and Gladstone. It was actually quite a moderate proposal.
Moderate how?
It aimed to add about 400,000 voters, mainly by lowering the rent qualifications in boroughs to £7 and counties to £14. Interestingly, there was no mention of seat redistribution initially.
Okay, so why the opposition?
Fierce opposition from both sides. The Conservatives, led by Lord Cranborne, who later became Lord Salisbury, thought it went way too far. He compared the state to a joint stock company where, not all shareholders should have equal votes. Disraeli himself was scathing, calling the potential new voters a horde of selfish and obscure mediocrities.
Ouch.
But then there was also a significant faction within the Liberals who opposed it, the Adulamites, as John Bright sarcastically nicknamed them, led by Robert Lowe.
Why were liberals opposing a liberal bill?
Lowe feared handing power to what he called the ignorant working classes. He accused them of venality, ignorance, drunkenness, and the facility for being intimidated. Pretty harsh stuff.
Very.
So when an amendment to reduce the number of new voters actually passed, the Liberal government was defeated and Russell resigned. Reform attempt number 1 failed.
But the pressure for reform didn't just dissipate, did it? You said it mounted incredibly rapidly after that failure.
It absolutely did. The incoming Conservative government, led by Derby with Disraeli in the Commons, initially hoped to delay things, but events just spiraled. John Bright embarked on another powerful speaking tour, whipping up support. Then, a sharp economic crisis hit in 1866. Bankruptcies, widespread unemployment, bread became expensive due to a poor harvest, and on top of that, a devastating cholera epidemic claimed 8,000 lives in London alone.
A perfect storm, really.
It really was. And then in July, there was that planned demonstration by the Reform League in Hyde Park. The government decided to close the park gates.
Which probably wasn't the best idea.
Exactly. It led to disturbances. Railings were torn down, about 1,400 yards of them, apparently. It wasn't massive violence, but what did that incident really signal to the politicians in power?
That things were getting serious. That the public wouldn't wait.
Precisely. It was a clear signal that reform could no longer be put off. This combination of circumstances convinced Derby and Disraeli that the time was now. They decided, quite cynically perhaps, to dish the Liberals by making a popular bid for reform themselves.
Seize the moment.
And that's exactly what Disraeli did in what became famously known as his leap in the dark. Both he and Derby were apparently willing to introduce a much more drastic bill than Gladstone's failed one, if it meant securing Tory power.
A big gamble.
Huge. Their own cabinet was divided. Cranborne and others were threatening to resign if the bill went too far. So their initial, quite mild bill introduced in February 1867 caused an uproar. It was clear it wouldn't pass.
So they had to change tack.
Disraeli then took a massive, calculated risk. He introduced a much more radical measure. This indeed led to Cranborne and 2 other cabinet members resigning in protest. But the really critical turning point was during the bill's passage through the Commons.
What happened there?
Various MPs, particularly radicals within the Liberal Party, proposed several amendments,
Right.
making the bill even more extreme. And surprisingly, Disraeli just accepted them, all of them.
He just accepted them. Why?
Well, that's the million-pound question. This pushed the bill to its final, much more far-reaching form, becoming law as the Second Reform Act in August 1867.
It sounds like a masterclass in political maneuvering, or maybe just chaos. What were the different theories trying to explain Disraeli's motivations for passing such a far-reaching bill, especially after all that initial conservative opposition?
Yeah, there are a few competing theories. The Liberals, for their part, basically claimed that Gladstone had forced it on the Tories through pressure, and Disraeli had just cynically accepted all the amendments simply to stay in power.
Okay, that's one view.
Disraeli himself, later on, promoted the Tory democracy theory. He suggested it was all part of a long-term grand plan to forge an alliance between the Tories and the newly enfranchised urban working class, that he'd cleverly maneuvered the Liberals into going further than they actually intended.
A strategic genius narrative.
Right. But historian Robert Blake, a major biographer of Disraeli, pretty bluntly called this simply untrue and basically retrospective boasting.
Right, so other theories.
Then there's the left-wing theory, which emphasizes the influence of those mass working-class demonstrations by the Reform League, especially the ones in early 1867. The argument is they scared the government into action.
Did they?
Well, it's worth noting there was actually less violence than may be expected, and Disraeli himself seemed largely unperturbed by the damage in Hyde Park. He wasn't easily panicked.
So which of these arguments holds the most water? What's the most convincing takeaway here about Disraeli's true intentions? What does Lowe suggest?
The most convincing argument, and what our source Norman Lowe leans towards, is that Disraeli and Derby's primary motivation was indeed political advantage. To get the credit for the reform, whatever form it took. to dish Gladstone and the Liberals, and ultimately to retain power.
Pure politics.
Pretty much. It's also doubtful that Gladstone was the primary driving force behind the bill's final radical form. In fact, Lowe points out it was a group of radical MPs who proposed the more extreme amendments and committee amendments that apparently horrified Gladstone himself.
Horrified him.
Yes. He reportedly called the passed bill a smash, perhaps without example. So the idea that Gladstone masterminded it seems unlikely. The leap in the dark really wasn't just a historical event. It's a fascinating case study.
How so?
It shows how political leaders, even sometimes against their own stated convictions, can be driven to radical change by this confluence of public pressure, circumstance, and, let's be honest, the ruthless pursuit of power. It shows that sometimes the biggest reforms come not from pure ideology, but from sheer political pragmatism.
That's a truly profound insight. Now, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the act is passed. What exactly did the 1867 Reform Acts change on the ground? What were its specific terms, and what was its immediate impact on British democracy?
Okay, the specifics. The act dramatically reshaped the franchise, especially in the towns. In the boroughs, the vote was extended to all male householders, both owner-occupiers and tenants, as long as they paid their local rates and had lived in their house for at least 1 year.
So basically household suffrage in the boroughs.
Pretty much. And lodgers paying £10 a year rent also got the vote. In the counties, the change was less dramatic. The vote went to ratepayers paying £12 a year in rates, and also to copyholders and leaseholders with land valued at £5 a year.
And what about the seats themselves? Was there redistribution?
Yes, there was significant seat redistribution. Smaller boroughs, those with populations under 10,000, lost 1 MP each. This freed up 45 seats.
Where did they go?
25 went to the counties, which were seen as underrepresented. 15 went to create new borough constituencies in growing industrial areas. 1 went to the University of London. And some large cities like Liverpool, Manchester, Leeds, and Birmingham were given a 3rd MP. An attempt at fair distribution, though, as we'll see, imperfect. And just quickly, the franchise in Scotland was brought broadly into line with England's, and they gained 7 seats transferred from England. In Irish boroughs, the vote was given to £4 ratepayers.
And the immediate effects of all this, you said they were dramatic.
Oh, absolutely dramatic. The electorate almost doubled overnight. It jumped from approximately 1.36 million voters to about 2.46 million.
Doubled.
Almost doubled. And crucially, most of these new voters were industrial workers living in the towns. This meant that really for the very first time you had something approaching genuine democracy, at least in the boroughs.
But you hinted it wasn't perfect. Despite that significant expansion, where did the leap in the dark fall short of full democracy? What were the catches?
There were definitely catches. Despite the big changes, it was still well short of full democracy. A key one was the county franchise. The voting qualification there remained high enough, 12-town ratepayer, to keep most agricultural laborers, who were the majority of the rural population and also rural miners, without the vote.
Why do that?
It seems like a deliberate, almost illogical discrimination. The thinking was likely to preserve the power of wealthy landowners in the countryside, a sort of conservative counterbalance if democracy had to be conceded in the towns.
Okay, what else?
Another huge issue. Voting was still held in public. There was no secret ballot yet. This lack of secrecy meant that working-class voters in the boroughs could easily be influenced or even intimidated by their employers and landlords.
That really undermines the whole point, doesn't it?
It significantly weakened the impact of the new franchise. That problem wasn't really solved until the Ballot Act came along in 1872.
And the seat distribution, you said it was imperfect.
Very uneven still. Many small towns with just over 10,000 inhabitants, like Tiverton, still kept 2 MPs. That was the same number as Glasgow, which had over 500,000 people. The south and east of England, generally more rural and conservative, remained overrepresented compared to the booming industrial Midlands and north. So still a long way to go on fair representation.
This raises an important question then. Beyond the immediate impact and its limitations, how did the act fundamentally change the nature of politics in Britain over the longer term? What were the unforeseen consequences, the ripple effects?
Well, several really significant unforeseen long-term results became apparent over time. Firstly, political campaigns themselves had to transform.
How so?
With these greatly increased electorates in the boroughs especially, it just wasn't feasible anymore to bribe voters individually or in small groups like they used to. It was too expensive, too difficult. This forced politicians to actually explain and justify their policies to a much wider public. Election campaigns gradually became more like accepted public procedures, focused on argument and persuasion, rather than just influence and bribery.
And who adapted first?
The Liberals, particularly under Gladstone's leadership, were probably the first to truly grasp this shift and leverage it effectively, especially as we saw in the 1868 general election. Secondly, and perhaps even more fundamentally for the long run, the Act spurred the development of modern party organizations.
Party organizations, how did the Act lead to that?
It was partly due to those new, large, three-member constituencies created in cities like Birmingham and Manchester. They came with a unique rule. Each elector could only vote for two candidates, even though 3 seats were up for grabs.
That's odd. Why?
It was meant to ensure some minority representation, but it created a problem of potential vote wastage for the majority party. If all your supporters voted for the same 2 popular candidates, your third candidate might lose out unnecessarily. The Birmingham Liberals were the first to really figure this out. They pioneered sophisticated local party organizations, the famous caucus, specifically to manage their voters. They'd instruct different sections of their supporters to vote for specific pairs of candidates to ensure an equal distribution of liberal votes among all 3 of their candidates.
Very organized.
Extremely. Maximizing their chances of electing all 3. The Conservatives saw this working and quickly followed suit, developing their own local and national structures. So before long, you had these robust national and constituency-level party machines developing, designed to mobilize support during elections and, crucially, to nurture and communicate with voters between elections. This really laid the groundwork for the highly organized, disciplined party system we recognize today.
So it's quite remarkable then. Disraeli engineers this massive Reform Act, becomes prime minister, yet despite his political triumph in passing it, his Conservative Party still lacked a Commons majority going into the next election.
Exactly.
And as you mentioned, to his intense disappointment, the Liberals won the 1868 general election and won it big, with a commanding majority of 112 seats. Why? Why did the Liberals, not the Conservatives who passed the act, ultimately benefit from this huge expansion of the franchise?
Yeah, it must have been galling for Disraeli. There were clear reasons for that Liberal victory in 1868, according to Lowe's. Firstly, campaign strategy. Gladstone and John Bright conducted an incredibly vigorous nationwide election campaign. They went out, spoke all over the country, making their case directly to the newly enfranchised voters.
Get out there.
Absolutely. Disraeli, in stark contrast, took a much more passive, almost old-fashioned approach. He apparently merely sent a printed election address to his own constituents in Buckinghamshire. He completely missed a golden opportunity to connect with those new borough voters, perhaps with a program of social reform that might have appealed to them.
Missed opportunity.
And policy.
Policy was key, too. Gladstone very astutely secured crucial support from middle and working class nonconformists, Methodists, Baptists, etc., by announcing the Liberal intention to disestablish the Anglican Church in Ireland.
Disestablish, meaning what exactly? Effectively stripping it of its official state privileges and public funding in Ireland. This was hugely popular with nonconformists throughout Britain, who resented the established status of the Anglican Church, which they didn't belong to, and felt excluded by it. It was a clear, popular, reformist stance that resonated.
So the 1867 Reform Act was truly a leap in the dark, an act passed by conservatives, driven by a complex mix of pressure and political calculation that ended up benefiting the Liberals, and despite its limitations, irrevocably altered the course of British democracy and fundamentally reshaped the dynamics of political parties.
Indeed. And maybe a final thought to leave you with, building on this source. Consider how this period of intense political maneuvering, this dramatic, almost accidental expansion of the franchise, really laid the groundwork for the modern party political system we recognize today. What lessons might it offer about the often messy, unpredictable interplay between public pressure, political opportunism, and the kind of lasting social change that shapes nations?